Thank you for attending this webinar, which is based on a talk that I gave at Hopemont in April 2025. We are going to cover a lot of ground over the next hour or so. I want to start by offering a synopsis of the field of Underground Railroad studies, as scholars have been contending with some of the same methodological issues for generations. I'll then give a brief history of commemoration efforts before delving into issues surrounding identification and designation using case studies from upstate New York and Kentucky. To give us a solid comparative framework, we'll mainly be focusing on church buildings. I'll also familiarize you with the processes for listing properties on the National Register of Historic Places and the Network to Freedom, which are two forms of designation administered by the National Park Service. The point of this talk is not to deny any building's potential association with the Underground Railroad, but rather to analyze the evidence that has been presented to date. While the Underground Railroad now looms large in America's historical memory, this was not always the case. According to Reverend Eber M. Pettit, whose family in Fredonia, New York, harbored freedom seekers, the term Underground Railroad itself first appeared in an 1839 article published in Washington, D.C. Its author had related an incident in which a boy named Jim was caught lurking around the Capitol. Under duress, he let slip the phrase, "the railroad and underground all the way to Boston." The article went on to condemn this apparent system as some secret Yankee arrangement. But conductors along the clandestine network arguably did their job too well, for tangible evidence of their activities was, and remains, elusive. In an 1884 retrospective, Amy Post, who operated a safe house in Rochester, acknowledged that the secrecy of the Underground Railroad's construction, its marvelous origin, the great number of passengers, the amount of freight transported thereon, can never be told. All its work was done in the dark. Researchers in the 1930s continued to wring their hands over the lack of verifiable accounts. Writing on the topic, Rochester-based journalist Willis B. Knowles compared his efforts to those of the sage geologists who look beneath the Earth's crust for strata to tell them stories millions years old. He believed that the investigator of this buried mystery can find only occasional vestiges and unsupported legends to establish the story of a traffic whose necessary secrecy left little trace. For all the romance that surrounded tales of the Underground Railroad, scholarship on the topic was almost non-existent before the 20th century. In the 1890s, academic Wilbur Siebert attempted to fill this lacuna by undertaking a massive oral history project in Ohio. The 2,500 interviews he initially conducted testified to a sprawling web of escape routes in that state. Siebert also aimed to expand the timescale of the Underground Railroad rather than viewing the 1830s as a watershed period in abolitionist mobilization. For instance, he referenced one of George Washington's letters from 1786 that mentioned an enslaved individual from Virginia who had escaped to Philadelphia with the aid of the Quakers in that city. Siebert continued to develop this thesis in his expansive 1898 book that grew out of his Ohio case study. In this work, he justified the use of oral history as a legitimate methodology, as his subjects tended to independently corroborate each other's accounts. On this slide, you can see a map of Underground Railroad routes that Siebert compiled. And Kentucky is clearly terra incognita. Siebert's work remained the seminal text in the field until the appearance of Larry Garra's The Liberty Line in 1961. On its first page, this text accused Siebert of giving scholarly sanction to a great mass of material that was partly legend and partly fact. Garra took issue with Siebert's binary portrayal of the typical abolitionist as a pure-hearted knight in white armor who plays the heroic role in the Underground Railroad drama. This depiction not only stole focus from African Americans' efforts at self-liberation and their key role in aiding freedom seekers, but also exaggerated the cohesiveness of the Underground Railroad itself. As Guerra put it, evidence for a nationwide conspiratorial network of Underground Railroad lines is completely lacking. Enslaved people, moreover, did not uniformly desire a northward migration, and some actually engaged in temporary desertion as a form of labor protest. Siebert, Guerra charged, was merely replicating the mid-19th century propaganda of white abolitionists who sought to boost their own profile and raise money in the process. More recently, scholars have attempted to synthesize these divergent approaches. Eric Foner, for instance, characterizes the Underground Railroad as a system of interlocking local networks centered on vigilance committees whose activities waxed and waned. Jesse Olsavsky also elevates the vigilance committees as the revolutionary anti-slavery vanguard that created an open space in which learning among runaways, abolitionists, and other marginalized groups could bloom. These dialogues took the committees in a more activist direction as they provided direct aid to freedom seekers rather than appealing to slaveholders through moral suasion. This perspective situates enslaved individuals as authors of their own destinies and reflects a broader reorientation in Underground Railroad studies that has influenced government programs as well. So that's the historiography in a very small nutshell. Now let's investigate efforts to publicize the Underground Railroad on the national and state levels that have been underway since 1990. That year, Congress instructed the National Park Service, or NPS, to determine how best to interpret and commemorate this history. That directive led to the creation of the Underground Railroad Advisory Committee, which completed its final report in 1995. It determined that 27 units of the NPS operated assets connected to the Underground Railroad, while 380 sites and structures across 29 states, the Caribbean, Canada, and Mexico would be eligible for inclusion in a new network. The parameters for listing were rather broad, as the committee believed it should extend beyond safe houses to include courthouses where legal challenges related to escape and flight occurred, kidnapping sites, maroon communities, and freedom destinations that holistically could illuminate freedom seekers' journeys. Based on these findings, 2 congressmen introduced a bill in 1997 to establish a national Underground Railroad network to freedom under the auspices of the NPS. This program prioritized the listing of federal, state, and private properties with a verifiable connection to the Underground Railroad that were listed on the National Register or eligible. But such circumscription was at odds with the committee's original vision of a borderless network. And this methodological nationalism is still reflected in the NPS's ArcGIS map, which terminates firmly at the Canadian border. The committee's desire to include locations relating to kidnapping and other transitory occurrences were also difficult to realize in practice, as the register's limited definition of sites typically includes places of prolonged habitation or large-scale events such as Civil War battles. Moreover, the bill failed to clarify how evidence of purported Underground Railroad connections would be verified in practice. On this slide, I've included a list of the types of association that a building or site must possess to warrant listing on the Network to Freedom. We'll come back to these later in the talk. This federal undertaking prompted a similar statewide initiative in 1998 to create an Underground Railroad heritage trail in New York, which itself led to a series of conferences. This flurry of activity influenced the work of SUNY Oswego historian Judith Wellman, who has overseen a series of surveys of historic resources related to the Freedom Trail, abolitionism, and African American life in Oswego, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, Wayne, Montgomery, Niagara, and Oneida counties. Ranging between 300 and 600 pages apiece, The surveys include properties both existing and demolished. Some of these buildings are concretely tied to the Underground Railroad, while others are not. Beginning with the Oswego test study, Wellman created a 1 to 5 point ranking system for gauging these connections. As this methodology has remained influential, it's worth examining it in closer detail. A 1 on this scale was awarded to any site that was likely unrelated to the Underground Railroad. A 2 was given to a property that might reasonably have been associated with the Underground Railroad, but for which they had as yet no corroborating evidence. If a property owner or resident exhibited a strong commitment to abolitionism, such as by participating in anti-slavery societies or signing petitions, and vague local stories attested to their role in the Underground Railroad, that site might be classified as a 3. If a chain of informants behind an oral history tradition could be identified by name, or if that oral history involved figures in anti-slavery groups, the property in question would be designated a 4. Finally, a 5 was reserved for any site that could be tied to Underground Railroad activity from primary sources recorded as close as possible to the time of their involvement. Ideally, these textual traces would be left by known participants in the Underground Railroad or Vigilance Committee members. So far, I've discussed the origins of the Network to Freedom and explained the Wellman classification system. The last type of designation I want to introduce you to is listing on the National Register, which extends to any building, structure, object, or site over 50 years of age that has both significance and integrity. There are 7 types of integrity that I've listed here, with feeling and association being the most subjective. I'll parse the meaning of integrity throughout this talk, as many Underground Railroad properties, even some listed on the National Register, lack this important attribute. Now we are going to venture to upstate New York for the first of our case studies. I want us to consider how Underground Railroad connections are substantiated and how buildings received designation based on this evidence. The answers may surprise you. Located in the historic core of Black settlement in Ithaca, the St. James African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church dates to around 1836 and claims to be the denomination's oldest continually functioning place of worship in America. The resurgence of interest in the Underground Railroad has garnered the church substantial publicity. Beginning in 2021, Cornell University's Department of Archaeology, a professor in the Africana Studies Department, and Reverend Terrence King spearheaded a dig at the site that was conducted with the assistance of community members. This initiative aimed to clarify the church's role in the Underground Railroad, presumably by locating the remains of obscured tunnels or passages. As the leadership of St. James has given credence to these rumors over the years, local papers likewise concluded that the church was the main station in Ithaca, hiding many slaves in the basement for 20 years. But while St. James uncontestably has remained at the center of African American life in Ithaca for almost 2 centuries, its classification as an Underground Railroad nexus warrants further scrutiny. The characterization of Ithaca as an anti-slavery hub dates to the 1960s, when the local historical society produced a few short studies on the topic. More recently, scholars associated with this society, which is now known as the History Center, have acknowledged that they have no idea how many freedom seekers moved through Ithaca at a time. County historians have similarly recognized that most runaway people or freedom seekers did not come through Ithaca or Tompkins County. Still, newspaper articles and student projects have generally accepted the findings of mid-century scholarship, despite the lack of firm documentation. For our purposes, we'll be reviewing the original designation of St. James as a point of entry into a wider debate over the nomination of abolitionist churches to the National Register and the Network to Freedom. Press releases pertaining to the dig at St. James routinely mention the same historical connections to establish its role as an underground railroad depot. Certainly, anti-slavery activists filled its congregation. The church's pastors included Thomas James, who had been born into slavery in Canajoharie before escaping to Canada via the Erie Canal. In 1823, James joined the AME Zion Church in Rochester and contributed to the Rights of Man newspaper. Ordained in 1833, he was transferred to Ithaca 3 years later. Thereafter, James cycled through various AME Zion churches on the East Coast and introduced parishioner Frederick Douglass to members of the regional anti-slavery network in New Bedford. James also aided freedom seekers in his own right, liberating an enslaved woman named Lucy from a train car in Massachusetts. Yet James's early labors in Ithaca remain obscure. In his own autobiography, he briefly mentioned that he had bought a site for a church edifice for the little colored religious society that already existed in the village and saw it built during the 2 years of his stay. Following James's departure, St. James hosted another minister, the redoubtable Jermaine Logan, who was posted at numerous churches in upstate New York during the 1840s. However, his contributions to the daily operations of these churches are still unclear. Logan himself glossed over his ecclesiastical activities in his autobiography, as did later chroniclers of the AME Zion Church. In any case, it is highly unlikely that Logan utilized St. James Church as an actual safe house. When working full-time as an Underground Railroad conductor in Syracuse between 1856 and 59, he and his wife famously opened their own home at 293 Genesee Street to freedom seekers and made little effort to conceal this activity. No study to my knowledge has attempted to locate the Ithaca residence of either James or Logan, as their time in the city predates the compilation of city directories. Histories of St. James Church also note that Harriet Tubman was a frequent visitor and may have left 4 people in Ithaca. A small community of self-liberated African Americans did settle in Ithaca in the mid-19th century. Between 1800 and 1875, there were at least 53 families in Tompkins County with a male head who had been born into slavery. References to Tubman's attendance also date to the 1960s, when journalist James Doherty wrote a series of articles on the subject. He reported that a Mrs. Frank L. Johnson of 313 Cascadilla Street can recall the visits of Harriet Tubman to Mrs. Johnson's mother. She said she was invariably dressed in a gingham dress, wore a white apron and bandana, and carried a gun. This oral history seems plausible, though Doherty neglected to properly source it. The 1930 federal census confirms that Frank and Anna Johnson, who were both African American, lived at that address. As Anna was born in 1893 to parents who also reported their place of birth as New York State, her mother very well could have hosted Tubman at some point. But the apparent lack of an obituary complicates any effort to discern her maiden name and locate her family's original address. A later article in the Ithaca Journal from 1978, which reported on St. James's restoration efforts, also claimed that Tubman journeyed to Ithaca several times from Auburn, though no written proof of her visits has been found. 2 more pieces of evidence are typically used to associate St. James with the Underground Railroad. The first is an account in Frederick Douglass's diary that testifies to his attendance at an 1852 anti-slavery meeting at the church. He not only noted the cleanliness of the building, but also the preponderance of white people in his audience. This visit was hardly exceptional for Douglass, who traveled far and wide, even to Britain, lecturing for abolitionist societies. The second source comes from an 1889 Ithaca Journal article that reflected on the death of freedom seeker Daniel Jackson, who had arrived in Ithaca around 1859. In that piece, Tanner E.S. Esty recounted giving Jackson employment after a pastor from St. James approached him. Apparently, this unnamed clergyman would visit Esty every few days and inquire about employment opportunities for recently arrived fugitives. I have been unable to locate the article in question, as it does not appear to be digitized, and no researcher, to my knowledge, has established the identity of this mysterious figure. Given the absence of documentation attesting to James and Logan's Ithaca-based Underground Railroad activities, the single uncorroborated account of Tubman's church attendance, and the mention of the anonymous pastor in the Ithaca Journal, it is likely that St. James would earn a 3 on the Wellman ranking scale. Curiously, the site is not listed on the Network to Freedom. One county historian has also expressed doubts that the church functioned as a safe house after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, as it would have been too obvious a target. What factors, then, influenced the successful nomination of the church to the National Register in 1982? Since 1974, when the church was listed as a local landmark, the St. James congregation had been seeking designation to bolster their funding for restoration projects. By 1978, the church had obtained a $20,000 grant for an exterior renovation from a community development program and had applied for $30,000 through the Small Cities Block Grant Program. According to its reverend, listing on the register would protect the building as long as the government lasts and will qualify the church for federal preservation grants. But in his eyes, it was already a national landmark, whether it is approved or not. Covering this beat for the Ithaca Journal, Jane Marcham reported that members of St. James and other Ithacans did help many blacks taking the Underground Railroad routes to freedom. That much is documented, but whether the church itself actually harbored runaway slaves is one of those things known only by word of mouth. Meanwhile, Cornell student and parishioner Patricia Clark had begun compiling a historical narrative of the church for the National Register nomination. As documentary evidence confirmed the participation of the congregation's members and pastors in abolitionist agitation, she was of the mindset that we don't really need to prove that the building itself was a station on the Underground Railroad. While some church members speculated about the existence of a trap door to the basement, it seems that the majority dismissed these rumors. Marcham's subsequent interview with Lucy Brewer, a state historic preservation office employee, further illuminated that agency's thought process. Although Brewer acknowledged that the state committee usually considers landmarks from an architectural standpoint, architecture was not the reason behind the St. James nomination. But documents produced by church members showed Frederick Douglass, a key figure in the anti-slavery movement, and other black leaders had visited the church, whose members and pastors also are believed to have aided the Underground Railroad. The church's present-day role in the community was an added factor. Here, Brewer was likely referring to a common and unresolved issue involving the designation of churches from the period, a lack of physical integrity. In its original form, St. James was a one-story building composed of rough-hewn fieldstone with rectangular windows. A second story was added in 1861, which so dramatically changed its appearance that a later city directory regarded the finished product as an entirely new building. Subsequent alterations included the addition of a vestibule in 1895, a belfry in 1904, and a rose window in 1945. Clearly straining to evidence the church's integrity, the National Register nomination insisted that the original stone meeting house is still visible in the present foundation. Brewer's observation that the church's role in the community impacted the SHPO's deliberation is also noteworthy. At this time, the city of Ithaca was purchasing and flipping houses in the vicinity of the church, including those once inhabited by freedom seekers, as part of an urban revitalization campaign. Policymakers then presumably regarded the AME Zion Church as an enduring institution and a force for social uplift that warranted this recognition. Arguably, the designation criteria were slightly relaxed to accomplish this grander goal. In the long run, however, St. James has eclipsed other properties in Tompkins County with much better documented Underground Railroad connections. While one may question the physical integrity of St. James, the fact that the congregation has remained active in the same location since the 1830s undoubtedly impacted its designation. The same cannot be said for other AME and AME Zion churches in New York State, where worshippers frequently relocated to new premises as their numbers expanded and contracted. And yet, many of these religious properties are listed on the National Register or the Network to Freedom due to their presumed connections with the Underground Railroad, even if they were constructed after the Civil War. In the next part of this talk, I'll account for these discrepancies by delving into the histories of the African American churches as fundamentally liberationist entities. I will then reflect upon how the designation of individual church buildings has produced irregularities that run counter to established listing criteria. Both the AME and AME Zion churches were break-off denominations from the mainstream Methodist Episcopal Church that was established at the Baltimore Christmas Conference of 1784. Methodism had been making headway in America since the 1760s, when Church Father John Wesley dispatched several agents to the colonies to spread the faith. In Britain, Wesley's Methodism attracted followers amongst the lower echelon of society, including the small population of Africans in London. His 1774 Thoughts on Slavery text reprobated the slave trade and further attracted Africans to the Methodist Church. A handful of black ministers in America were even permitted to preach to predominantly white audiences. These included Richard Allen, a former slave from Delaware who purchased his freedom in 1783 and thereafter toured the East Coast as an itinerant preacher. By the late 1700s, however, the American Methodist Episcopal Church had begun to veer away from Wesley's theological emphasis on religious and racial egalitarianism. Leaders at St. George's Church in Philadelphia attempted to relegate black members to the galleries, citing overcrowding. Richard Allen resisted this edict and was forcibly removed from his usual seat. Incensed by this mistreatment, Allen and several other African American congregants abandoned the church and reconstituted the Mutual Aid Free African Society into an alternative religious body, from which Bethel Church sprang. Meanwhile, the Methodist John Street Church in New York City was similarly unable to accommodate a surge in black members. In 1796, a small African American committee that included former slave and longtime church employee Peter Williams received authorization from Bishop Francis Asbury to erect their own religious establishment. The resultant Zion Church was constructed at the corner of Leonard and Church Streets in 1801 and was the first religious edifice built expressly for the people of color in New York. While both the AME and AME Zion churches were emancipatory projects born out of a frustration with the white Methodists' racial intolerance, they differed in their particulars. The AME Church, under Allen's helm, replicated the formal structure of the Methodist Episcopal Church, with an internal hierarchy and a commitment to missionary activity in far-flung locales from Ontario to Haiti. Doyens of the AME Church, including Allen, also endorsed the controversial emigrationist aims of the American Colonization Society, or ACS, which proposed black resettlement in Africa. Henry Clay and other prominent Lexingtonians supported the society. But William Lloyd Garrison and his acolytes in the American Anti-Slavery Society disparaged the ACS for implying that free African Americans were seditious troublemakers who would be unable to assimilate into white communities. At the outset, the Zion Church forbid its ministers from having anything to do with that which was styled the Allen movement, though this rift was mended by the 1820s. The AME Zion Church also differed from the AME in its organizational model and its relative disinterest in global proselytizing. Yet the churches found common ground in their advocacy of anti-slavery political agitation and their material support for freedom seekers. As one historian puts it, churches were venues where fugitive slaves were assisted, where slavery itself was denounced, and where blacks organized to defend their rights. Clergy led, supported, and facilitated these functions. Both Allen and his wife, Sarah, sheltered fugitives and provided them with funds. AME churches in Cincinnati and Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, also supposedly functioned as Underground Railroad stations. According to one AME publication, the town of Montrose, Pennsylvania, became known as the City of Refuge for slaves due to its naturally fortified location. After 1850, AME ministers also visited the Don settlement in Ontario to see if Canada would be a safe asylum for freedom seekers. Meanwhile, the AME Zion Church boasted its own network of committed station masters, including Jermaine Logan, Thomas James, Harriet Tubman, and Catherine Harris, who at one point sheltered 17 individuals simultaneously at her home in Jamestown, New York. Earl Conrad's influential 1943 study of Tubman further claimed that she conducted freedom seekers to the AME Zion Church in Rochester and hid them in its pews. In 1903, Tubman donated her own home and 25 acres in Auburn to the AME Zion Church. The illustrious tradition of anti-slavery activism within these churches has created a somewhat distortive effect, as scholars have struggled to separate the histories of congregations from those of the actual buildings in which they gathered. Nominations approved in the 1970s are common perpetrators of this fallacy. Richard Allen's Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia was designated a national landmark in 1973, with a period of significance extending from 1794, the date the congregation formed, to the present. It was deemed significant for its architecture, association with religion, and ties to social, humanitarian, and Afro-American history. The nomination form acknowledged that at least 4 distinct church buildings had existed on the site. The first operated out of a blacksmith shop, the second was in use from 1805 until 1841, and the third was supposedly connected to a friend's meeting house by means of a tunnel that was used to facilitate the escape of runaway slaves via the Underground Railroad. But no documentation in the nomination was offered to support this claim. The most recent building in the Romanesque Revival style, which contains Allen's tomb, was not constructed until 1889, long after his death. In Rochester, the 1973 local historic designation of the Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church produced a similar anomaly. The Frederick Douglass League nominated this building in 1972, the same year that the city of Rochester took ownership of the property as part of a broader urban renewal campaign. The first pages of this form established that the church was constructed at this location in 1832 and underwent 3 renovations. Moreover, it claimed that the building served as a center for the Underground Railroad, while Douglass also reportedly printed his North Star paper out of its basement for a time. The church's champions further lauded it as the most significant living memorial of a vitally important chapter in Rochester history, the advancement of Black people from the ranks of escaped slaves to positions of community leadership. Later in the report, however, its drafters acknowledged that the congregation had erected new buildings on the site in both 1879 and 1907. The League's revealing justification for designation is worth quoting at length. While the church is not the original structure on the site, the community has endowed it with the cultural significance of the past. In 1971, following the tragic riots at Attica Prison, the funeral of a black prisoner killed in the uprising had symbolic significance for Rochester's entire black community. The funeral was held in the AME Zion Church, and the congregation was so large that it exceeded the capacity of the building. Much as St. James in Ithaca has earned protection for its role as a fixture in the local black community, so too did the AME Zion Church in Rochester receive a designation in response to ongoing social and political tensions. Still, determining how much of the original fabric of the building was incorporated into later remodels would clarify its eligibility for National Register listing. Verifying the Tubman connection would, at the very least, support the church's inclusion on the Network to Freedom. In other cases, active AME or AME Zion congregations have linked their church buildings to the Underground Railroad without publicly presenting firm evidence. Established in 1828, the Israel AME Church in Albany claims to be the oldest black church in upstate New York and invested in an anti-slavery narrative. In 2019, its leadership dedicated supposed hiding places within the building. These included the east wall, where Harriet Tubman slept, the basement hallway, which served as the Underground Railroad tunnel to Canada, the rear stairwell in the tunnel they believed dumped out into the Hudson River, the closet space in the sanctuary, and the balcony closet. As for the building itself, an undated historical sketch attached to its 1976 inventory form suggests that Reverend Thomas Jackson designed and constructed the church between 1845 and 1854. The form itself, however, fails to mention any presumed Underground Railroad connections and puts the date of construction between 1860 and 1869. A recent report on the residence of conductor Stephen Myers, a fixture of the Albany abolitionist scene, indicates that he taught at an African-American school in the basement of Israel AME from 1842 to 1845. His school may have been housed in a version of the church that predated the current building, but even if Israel AME's date of construction is confirmed, this case study presents a more existential issue. In the absence of documentary or compelling oral histories, can we simply assume that AME and AME Zion churches were involved in the Underground Railroad on account of their trenchant abolitionist beliefs? And would this ideological stance alone be sufficient to sanction these properties' designation? Israel AME is located within local and National Register historic districts, but it is not individually landmarked, nor is it listed on the Network to Freedom. Even accounting for infill, the notion of a tunnel to the Hudson River, which would be about 8 city blocks in length, is quite far-fetched. 19th century churches are amongst the most common historic resources linked to the Underground Railroad in upstate New York. And yet, past listings on the National Register or the Network to Freedom may raise some eyebrows, as their integrity and period of significance have not been properly considered. In my master's thesis on this topic, I isolated 3 types of religious properties: those that operated as safe houses or claimed active Underground Railroad conductors amongst their leadership, those that espoused anti-slavery beliefs or included African American members but were not hubs of activity, and so-called reach buildings that contained divided congregations, are not extant, or were in fact constructed after the Civil War. For our purposes, I want to present a few of these reach cases to illustrate some common inconsistencies. The First Congregational Church in Niagara Falls offers a prime example of a divided assembly. For years, members squabbled over whether to affiliate with the abolitionist Congregationalists, who exercised local power, or the hierarchical Presbyterians, who are more likely to oppose anti-slavery agitation. In 1856, one major trustee withdrew because he did not want to see the church become a haven for abolitionist speakers. Despite these unresolved tensions and the lack of any apparent Underground Railroad link, aside from the presence of one abolitionist minister, Judith Wellman recently selected the church as a candidate for National Register listing. Other religious buildings that have appeared on freedom trails and the Network to Freedom were not even constructed until after the Civil War. Two properties in Elmira, the Park Church and the First Baptist Church, exemplify this trend. Syracuse-based architect Horatio Nelson White designed the first of these churches, which was constructed in 1874. According to its 1977 National Register nomination, the building was significant not only for its unusual eclectic design, but also for its congregation's strong abolitionist philosophy and their resulting concern with humanitarian causes. Thomas Kennicott Beecher, a member of a prominent anti-slavery family, oversaw this body and espoused a church-home idea that called for a mixed-use sacred and social space. While Beecher certainly advocated for the preservation of the Union, during his time in Elmira, there is no evidence that he assisted with the Underground Railroad in that city. The building's anachronistic inclusion on the Network to Freedom seems to be based on its congregation's anti-slavery activism in the 1840s, despite the fact that its National Register nomination selected 1872 as the beginning of its period of significance. Another property that curiously appears on the Network to Freedom is the First Baptist Church, which, until a recent fire, was located in a National Register district, but was not individually landmarked. This building was tenuously connected to the Underground Railroad linchpin John W. Jones, who reportedly assisted 800 freedom seekers. At one time, he resided next to the earlier iteration of the church and worked as its sexton. In 1890, however, the church demolished Jones's house and built a brand new sanctuary on the land. Rather oddly, an entirely different John Jones house exists in the city and now contains the John Jones Museum, which does not appear on the Network to Freedom despite its listing on the National Register. These cases, then, testify to an incompatibility between the Network to Freedom and the Register. The arbiters of the network are willing to recognize the current location of a congregation clearly descended from one active in the Underground Railroad. But I would imagine that the powers that be at the Register would swiftly reject the designation of a post-Civil War building on these grounds. We may therefore conclude that the network's database functions best as a public history resource rather than a repository of information that can inform preservation initiatives. Congregational histories can overshadow building histories in Kentucky as well. In the summer of 2024, First Baptist in Winchester invited us to conduct a site visit at Allen Chapel, an 1898 church that they had acquired in 2015. In 1866, the first black church in that city was constructed on this site, and that body then joined the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in 1870. In discussing the future of Allen Chapel, we were told the historic church was likely significant because Frederick Douglass had given a speech there. This struck me as a bit odd, though, as Douglass had died in 1895. Undoubtedly, this event was foundational to the history of the congregation, but it occurred in a wholly different building. Now, let's revisit a local church with which many of my viewers in Kentucky hopefully are familiar. Since the mid-20th century, scholars and congregation members have produced varying accounts of St. Paul AME's development. Before I present my own research, I want to relate some of the information that these earlier studies contain. Architectural historian C. Frank Dunn was quite active from the 1940s to the 1960s when he contributed weekly building histories to the Sunday Herald Leader. The quality of his deed work is usually exceptional. He also produced a voluminous history of Lexington's earliest properties that survives in hard copy but was never formally published. In that text, he hypothesized that the original church building was already standing when St. Paul's trustees purchased the land from Charles Wilkins in 1827. This edifice consisted of a 3-bay front with pilaster-like shafts and perhaps resembled Transylvania University's Greek Revival Medical Hall. He also determined that an 1878 renovation produced the elongated arched windows with brick hood molds as well as the bracketed cornice. C.C. Townsend's renovation in 1906 added the entry tower and lengthened the auditorium by 1 bay. Clay Lancaster's history of St. Paul largely recapitulates Dunn's, though he does reference another expansion that transpired around 1850. A 1991 designation report adds its own gloss on this account, suggesting that much of the stable that the congregation first used was in fact demolished around 1830 and replaced by a bespoke church. Departing from this established narrative, both Dr. W.H. Ballard and Reverend H.L. Parks contended that the present building was actually constructed anew around 1862, when the trustees acquired a 125-foot by 100-foot parcel that was part of the city's stray cattle pen. My goal here is to use the deed records and maps, both bird's eye and fire insurance, to create a more precise account of St. Paul's evolution. Once this assessment is in place, we may further consider what the building can materially tell us about its possible Underground Railroad connections. So let's begin at the beginning, that being the 1827 deed by which Charles Wilkins conveyed a parcel on North Upper to St. Paul's early trustees. This document crucially refers to a brick building, formerly used by said Wilkins as a stable, and now occupied by the people of color as a meeting house. The trustees named on the deed included Daniel Francis, John Skinker, Peter Lewis, Benjamin Tibbs, and William Dolan. Out of this crew, Francis, Lewis, and Tibbs were formerly enslaved individuals who were manumitted between 1808 and 1818. It is unclear if Skinker was ever a slave. In 1808, he bought 6 acres at Cane Run from Asa Wilgus, the builder of Pope Villa. Thereafter, he purchased a slave's freedom in 1814 and later sold Tibbs land. After the Civil War, Tibbs participated in the first Convention of Colored Men of Kentucky and was a member of the Kentucky State Benevolent Association. In 1866, lawyer Madison C. Johnson recounted that he had represented a Negro man named Tibbs who had kept a school in Lexington and was tarred and feathered. Johnson prosecuted the offenders and received damages for Tibbs. It therefore appears that the trustees who purchased the property from Wilkins were, for the most part, formerly enslaved and public-spirited individuals. Now, let's delve into the expansion of the building itself. There is no map that I know of that illustrates the appearance of St. Paul in the 1830s, so how Dunn came up with his description remains a mystery. In March 1850, what I consider to be the second generation of trustees acquired an adjoining 7-foot by 95-foot parcel that lay to the south of the church. The question then is, what did the church use this sliver of land for? Did they construct a wholly new church on the site, expand the existing building in some fashion, or develop it at all? I don't have a definite answer to this, but I can tell you that the rear third of the church's lot remained empty until the 1870s. This 1851 bird's eye view from the perspective of Old Morrison shows a simple front gable building with Wilkins Alley to the right. An 1855 representation, which is not terribly accurate, depicts a protruding section to the rear that may have served as an apse. If we are to trust the 1857 bird's eye view, it appears that a framed addition with a lean-to had been attached to the original brick building. The apse-like extension seems to have disappeared by 1871. Who were the trustees overseeing the church's possible expansion in the 1850s? Amongst their number were James Turner, whom you will hear more about in a moment. His fellow trustees included Charles Buckner, Robert Dolan, Liberty Ross, and Moses Spencer. Emancipated in 1833, Spencer was active in the furniture business and in 1852 entered into a partnership with Buckner, who had obtained his freedom in 1830. The church purchased another lot to its immediate south in 1862 and soon built a parsonage upon it. At this time, Spencer was still serving as trustee alongside Henry Britton, Andrew Bryant, John Bell, and Kenny Bryce. The 1867 city directory contains key information about these men. Britton, the father of famous Kentuckians Mary Ellen Britton and Juliet Britton Hooks, was working as a barber at the Phoenix Hotel. Bryant was listed as a boot and shoemaker, and John Bell was classified as a laborer. Out of these trustees, James Turner's life is perhaps the best documented. Liberated in 1841, he worked as a plasterer and acquired the federal-style row house at 331 South Mill through his former enslaver, John H. Wilson. In the 1860s, Turner emerged as a key advocate for educating the city's 2,000 black children. The American Missionary Association had set up a school on 4th Street, where St. Andrews now stands, that was helmed by E. Bell Mitchell, but this space quickly reached capacity. Meanwhile, the city's leading black women, including Turner's wife, Irena, launched a campaign to acquire the old Methodist Episcopal Church on Church Street and rechristened it as Ladies' Hall. Turner then allied with the Freedmen's Bureau and the AMA to finance and staff the Howard School, which was based at this location. With the support of Madison C. Johnson, who was now a judge, the school board appointed Turner as a trustee to disperse the tax money of black property owners that was earmarked for public education. Yet this percentage was inadequate, and Turner was constantly beseeching the council to provide more funds. His exertions led to the founding of the Daniel Hand School at Corral and Race, and another facility at the old Pleasant Green Baptist Church in the 1870s. None of these survives. While some accounts identify Turner as a preacher and church elder, others omit him from their list of reverends based at St. Paul. However, he did buy 2 houses between Mechanic and 3rd that the church may have utilized. To complicate matters, a wholly different James M. Turner served as pastor from 1887 to 89 and resided in the parsonage. The 1991 designation report for St. Paul references a newspaper article from 1876 that claims the remodel cost $4,000. I have been unable to locate this source, but it's clear from the fire insurance maps that this renovation extended the building to Wilkins Alley. I also suspect that this new brick addition in the rear may have replaced the earlier framed one that we saw on the 1857 map. The green arrow in this photo shows the dividing line between the older and the new sections. One can also date these campaigns by their brickwork. Like many buildings in the mid-19th century that wanted to impress, the facade of St. Paul was laid in the most expensive Flemish bond pattern. The sidewalls were then constructed in cheaper common bond. In the 1870s section, however, the brickwork is Flemish bond every 6th course, which is characteristic of the last quarter of the 19th century. The lancet window on the church's rear wall was possibly relocated from its earlier position on the north or south walls during the 1870s alterations. Based on this information, I would like to briefly assess St. Paul using the Wellman scale and the requirements for designation on the National Register and the Network to Freedom. The church would most likely be awarded 2 or 3 points on the scale, mostly due to the existence of an oral history that references Underground Railroad activity. But this classification system has its limitations. In the North, abolitionists signed public petitions and even broadcast their Vigilance Committee membership in the papers. But this kind of activism would obviously have had dire repercussions in the South, especially for Lexington's formerly enslaved inhabitants. It seems to me, then, that Wellman's scale would need to be modified in some way to take into account the specific dynamics of covert anti-slavery activity in border states like Kentucky. Now let's turn to the question of designation. It's one worth asking, even though St. Paul is already a contributing building in the Register's North Side Historic District. If it were to be individually listed, our friends at the Kentucky Heritage Council would ask for a defined period of significance and an evaluation of integrity. And if someone were to make the case for significance based on Underground Railroad connections, they might select a period of significance from 1827 to 1865. But I do think it would be challenging to argue that the building has integrity of workmanship, design, feeling, and association that materially links it to this period. We don't have exact information on the first and second building campaigns, but the 1877 remodel was evidently quite intensive and included the construction of the stairs leading to the attic. Instead, I would be inclined to focus on the role of the church as a catalyst for educational and social uplift within the city's Black community. We could then tie it to the exertions of James Turner and extend the period of significance to the later 19th century. Finally, let's turn to the network to freedom types of association. I don't think we have the requisite evidence to classify the church as a station. However, there could be 2 strategies for listing. We could further delve into the histories of the trustees whose names I mentioned to better determine their individual participation in anti-slavery activity. St. Paul might also be recognized as a church associated with congregations active in the Underground Railroad, but there are caveats here, which I've put on the slide. They are not terribly well phrased, but the most germane one for us is the first, that a distinction must be made between congregations which supported the abolition of slavery in general, not typically eligible, and those, fewer in number, which went further and actively supported the Underground Railroad, considered eligible for the network to freedom. What exactly is active support? And does this baseline level of active support differ between regions? Certainly, AME churches in upstate New York were much more capable of vocal advocacy than those in Kentucky. We don't really have a precedent to draw from to clarify these issues. Currently, there are only 2 sites in Kentucky listed on the Network to Freedom with standing buildings from the period. These are the Dinsmore House, which was a site of escape, and Camp Nelson, which has been interpreted as a destination site. This all begs another question. Might there be other properties in Lexington eligible for listing on the Network to Freedom? Perhaps. Let me direct your attention to the restored BGT plaque property at 343. The build date for this rather Spartan federal-style house is murky. However, we know that Reverend Adam Rankin was awarded the 5-acre Outlot 32 parcel that spanned from 3rd to 4th Streets in an 1808 lawsuit against Samuel Johnson. The house was likely constructed between that year and 1817, when the house was sold to State Representative John Bell. Best known for causing esoteric schisms in the Presbyterian Church, Rankin also used enslaved labor to advance his economic interests. One mixed-race woman, Millie Hayden, was compelled to work at a dairy that may have stood on this property. When Rankin liquidated his assets prior to his ill-fated 1827 pilgrimage to Jerusalem, he traded her enslaved son, Lewis Hayden, to a clock salesman in exchange for a carriage and 2 horses. Hayden famously escaped to Ohio in 1844 with the aid of Delia Webster and Calvin Fairbank. Settling in Detroit and later Boston, he aided freedom seekers and was instrumental in advancing the anti-slavery cause. Concretely linking Hayden to the Limestone House has proved challenging, as Rankin owned numerous properties in town, and we only have city directories from 1806 and 1838 to go off of. Still, Hayden may very well have lived on the property, as he was born in 1811, 3 years after Rankin acquired it. We've now reached the end of this lecture, and I hope you've learned something about the history of Underground Railroad studies, processes for landmarking historic buildings, and the politics of commemoration in multiple regions. When it comes to uncovering the history of Underground Railroad activity in Kentucky, it is clear there is still ample work to be done. But I am certainly grateful for all of the labor that individuals who attended the in-person presentation of this talk have invested in addressing this important topic.